Welcome, 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 welcome. Good morning. The session you're in is Language at the Core, why all students need academic language development in grades TK through 5. I am Gina Chavez. I'm the director of the California Reading and Literature Project in LA, down at Cal State LA. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Green, and I am Deborah Costa Hernandez, and I am the California Reading and Literature Project Executive Director based out of UCSD in San Diego.
So she's my boss, in a nutshell. Okay, you saw this fabulous graphic organizer, yes? Okay, so we're going to keep referring back to this throughout all of your sessions today because this is the visual of the entire framework. And we have the fancy animation. And why do we want to see that animation? What did you hear in the general session? Everything overlaps. Isn't that fabulous? Because if you've been in education long enough, we've known that for a long, long time. And when I first saw the animation, I was like, yeah, it kind of looks like those juggling balls that we do every day. So here we are with, it didn't go. Well, there we go. The language development is the session that we're going to talk, the theme. Yes, I'm trying to get those straight. The theme that we're focusing on in this session. So from the general session, I did not see a lot of hands for teachers, so I'm going to work backwards. In the room here, who is district office support? Oh, interesting that you sat over here too. Great. And what about site support? Both, okay. And administrators. Yes. And teachers, do we have? Yay! Oh, big yay for our two teachers in the room. Did I miss anyone? Okay, great. So you all fit in those categories. Wonderful. So our outcomes for this session, which is brief, I want to echo what was said in the general session. This is general overview, okay? This is not a deep examination of the framework, and it's not focused on strategies. What we really want to do is give you the big picture and have you look at just a few of the resources that come in the framework. Focusing on that theme of language development. So big picture, and we're looking through the lens of language. So here's that big picture. Language at the core, it crosses and covers all of the strands of the Common Core standards. So language is within and embedded within reading, writing, speaking, listening. It also is within all of the ELD standards. And you heard briefly from Pam Spiescher the 3 parts of the ELD standards: interacting in meaningful ways, how English works, and using foundational skills. Language is at the core of all of that. So just looking at how language is really called out as its own theme, I want you to take a moment to tell your partner, your elbow partner, why do you think language is called out as its own theme? So just talk for a moment. Why do you think language is its own theme in the framework? Right, and that's how students demonstrate if they've attained a standards. They have to use language in some way. So I'll tell you what I was told 20-something years ago when I was a beginning teacher. Reading and writing are like 2 boats on a sea of language. So your base of language has to be really broad. You have to have a lot of language background. We heard that in several of the comments this morning. Broad language background so you can address reading, writing, and we could add listening and content and all of that. But the language is that underlying skill that everyone has to have, and it has to be pretty broad. Why? One of our goals here is to promote and increase language proficiency and sophistication. So we're going to take a sampling of the standards. This is TK and first grade. And if you look at the standard listed there, it's a reading, literature, reading informational text, kindergarten 1.4. So that standard there, children learn to determine the meaning of words and phrases in text. So what is the inherent language in that standard? If they have to learn the meaning of words, what are we referring to?
Vocabulary.
Thank you. Oops, I went back way too many, didn't I? Yes. So go to the next one right underneath that. That's a speaking and listening skill. They build skill and effective use of language as they engage in focused discussions. We heard a lot about this morning. So what's happening with the language there? Communicating, interacting. Here's some from second and third. Making progress toward crafting their written language. Why? What are we doing again? And writing so someone else, exactly. And then by third grade, students engage in collaborative conversations. There's a lot of work around collaborative conversations where they build ideas. So again, speaking and listening, watching students in the classroom, giving them a prompt, listening. How are they communicating? Are they addressing your prompt? And here's 4-5. So I love this. 4-5, they continue all of that. And then, look at how specific this gets. Greek and Latin roots. Morphology. Vocabulary. Differentiating between contexts. Presentation versus small group instructions. So that's a brief look at the standards and how the language is embedded in the standards, and again, it's its own theme. I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
And here we go. And we intentionally selected standards that were not necessarily standards because that's what we want to show. And if you're using this to help your colleagues understand why language is at the core, we need to do this exercise that Gina just helped us. Look at a reading standard, look at a writing standard, and ask, what's the language required to do this well? What's the language required to do this well? What's the language required to do this well? So, in there, now I have to manage reading glasses, paper, microphone, and a clicker. You're in for a ride. So in the framework, language at the core, in the framework, language development, this theme covers 4 very important and key aspects. The first one being vocabulary development, which is usually when we talk about academic language development, we think of academic vocabulary, right? And with the tiers, tier 1, especially tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. But that's not enough. Academic language also encompasses the grammatical or discourse level understanding, so understanding different and complex syntactical structures and how text is organized differently to convey different ideas. That's part of understanding how language works. There's also this shift or this special emphasis, and this is something was mentioned this morning, on language awareness, the metalinguistic awareness. And it could have been there as part of your programs already, but now is explicitly in the framework. And it was explicit in the ELD standards because we had that part about understanding how English works. So the way I think about it is like, and you were talking about that, demystifying the academic language. I think about like the magician and kind of explaining to the kids, you know, what you see is not magic, it's a trick. And then here's how the magician does this. And here how she or he make you believe that what you saw is magic because they use these tricks and your mind, they understand how the brain works and what your mind is trying to do. So it's showing the kids the tricks behind the magic. To me, it's demystifying academic language. And then the ELD standards that, check that out. That's the extent of my skills in using animation by PowerPoint. They amplify, they augment the emphasis on language development and language awareness for English learners. And that, I cannot emphasize those 2 words, amplify and or augment. Because we, for many years, and not here, and maybe not in the districts and the schools that you represent, but you know of people who've always thought of a scaffolding instruction for English learners as simplifying, watering down, giving something less than, simpler, right? And that's not what it is. It's never been about that, but it's clear in this document that it is not about that. So, and when it comes to educating English learners, and this is from chapter 2, just a reminder that our English learners, and I just want to add here that the typical English learner, the one that takes the CELT, is one category of English learner, but we have other English learners, standard English learners, students for whom academic language is a second language. And we have to keep them in mind because they don't take the CELT. They're not as visible sometimes, but let's broaden our definition of English learner to include all students for whom academic language is a goal, is a target. And so our English learners are learning through content, right? Learning content through English, They're learning to use English, and they're also learning how English works simultaneously. And the part that holds that together is English language development. Because it is through English language development, through integrated ELD, we're supporting learning through content and learning to use English in content, and in some extent through designated ELD. So doing all three, both in integrated and sometimes in designated ELD. And I just want to say that we intentionally did not put a lot more about English language ELD in the presentation because this is about language development for all students, amplified for English learners. So instead of a 1 minute quick write, I'm going to give you a 1 minute quick think. How's that? And I want you to think, what is academic language? What is your definition of academic language? And you can 30 seconds. What is academic language for you? So in a minute, you're going to receive a handout, and yours is pink. And on figure 2.12, academic language, it comes from chapter 2 in the framework. We're going fast, so we have some time. We're trying to save some time at the end for a vignette. So we may not have enough time to read in depth, but I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to read through. Here's your purpose for reading. And you're just reading figure 2.12. Your purpose for reading is, how does this description of academic language matches up against your definition of academic language? How does this definition or description of academic language matches up against your own definition of academic language? And you have a minute and a half. How's that? I'll check with you in a minute and a half. So I just want to, if you didn't highlight this, to bring your attention to 3 points. On the second paragraph in the middle, the sentence that starts with however. Academic English encompasses much more than vocabulary. In schools and their academic settings, students choose particular language resources in order to meet the expectations of the people with whom they are interacting. Then on the next paragraph, third paragraph, the first sentence. From this perspective, language is a meaning-making resource, and academic English encompasses discourse practices, text structures, grammatical structures, and vocabulary, all inseparable from meaning. Right? And then the last, and I think the most important, at least for me, sentence is the first sentence on the last paragraph. Not all children come to school equally prepared to engage with academic English. However, all students can learn academic English, use it to achieve success in academic tasks across disciplines, and build upon it to prepare for college and careers. And that's the piece that we have to believe, that they all can learn academic English, right? Because some people may say, well, that is a deficit mentality if you think that they don't have it. If a deficit mentality, if you recognize that they don't have the academic language and you think they're doomed because they don't have academic language. What we're saying is They may lack academic language, but they can learn it. And where are they going to learn it? In school. Yes. You had your hand.
Yeah, one of the things that you asked us to highlight, the discourse practices, does that mean functional language like compare and contrast, proposition and support that?
And also types of registers, which is what we're going to talk about. Okay. So in the past, remember BICS and CALP, right? BICS, basic, our friends, basic, and they served us well for a long time. Basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. The only challenge with that is that they presented language as dichotomous. You're either social or academic. So the notion that this framework puts forward is not that you have either social or academic. We have registers. There are tasks, audiences, purposes for using language. And the smarter people I know and the smarter people you know are those who can adjust. And they can, when they're hanging out with friends, it's all that and oh my gosh, is he, he ain't. But when we're talking in a professional setting, they use proper, correct, standard English grammar. They have high-level vocabulary, and they can adjust to everything in between. So it's not about one or the other. It's about appropriate use of registers. So I'm going to take you to the next. In your handout, 2.14. What I'd like you to do is, as you read very quickly, this is the description of what register is. Identify 2 or 3 like critical points. 2 or 3 critical points. And you're going to share those critical points with somebody else. Absolutely. And I had the experience of watching a group of teenagers who were doing a presentation at a statewide conference about a project that they had. It was a science project. They moved up through and they were there. They were celebrated because of their success. And they were explaining to this group of 300 educators what it meant to them. And it was painful to hear them not being able to use an academic formal register in that situation. And this, aside from the way teenagers talk, is teenagers, like and like, because like. But even with that, you can tell the difference. And it was painful. And I said, they have every right to know this register so they can communicate this with the sophistication of their thinking and their skills, because they were incredibly smart students. They were able to accomplish something very important, and they didn't have the language to match what they were capable of doing. So that's the gift. That's the equity piece that we want. So very quickly, thank you for sharing that. So we specialize vocabulary. And it's also sentences and clauses that are densely packed with meaning. And you have an example, bullying is not permitted in our school. That's the example of nominalization, right? And then another example of what's likely to be found in text. There's also, and then somebody brought this up, we, as English speakers, we implicitly make those switches. Yes, please. Is when you use a verb or a verb as a noun. So bullying, typically, we don't bully in this place, but using it as a noun now becomes the subject of that sentence, and it's a way to pack in a lot of information in one word. Right? And there are some examples in your handout. On the second page are some examples. So as English speakers, we make assumptions because we are able to shift. But our students can't always shift. And we need to make it explicit to them and model how to do that. And so we have to show them what we do implicitly, show it explicitly. And how do we do that?
Interactive read-alouds. So interactive read-alouds are one way that we can promote language development But we have to look at the text that we're using. So the text that we're using has to be rich in formal text or narrative text. It has to have both the general academic language and specific, domain specific, and complex sentence structure, because that's what we're trying to have our students see. We want them to see those different words and sentence structures. So you want to pick text that's challenging. And in the interactive read aloud, you also want to use that as an opportunity to teach vocabulary. So one way of doing that is using these child-friendly definitions. And I was in a TK classroom just recently and had to explain disabilities. Disabilities, can we all say disability, okay, with 4 and 5-year-olds. And the good thing was the text that I was using, not interactive, it was just a read aloud, but the very first picture was a picture of a man with glasses on with a guide dog. Okay, what's his disability? Oh, he can't see. Right, right. So that's where we started with. But the level of the text was actually 3rd grade. And these were 4 and 5-year-olds. So that's one way that we can do it. Interactive read alouds, great strategy, but it's not enough. It's definitely not enough. It's not sufficient. So we really want to make sure that we are instructing vocabulary development. And really this, every time I read these slides, I go back to this is part of the planning. When teachers are planning, they have to plan their interactive read aloud. They have to plan for this instruction. They have to plan how they're going to instruct these words. Some strategies might be the teacher word learning strategies. How am I going to help my students determine the meaning of an unknown word? What am I going to do? So with disability, I had to look it up. I had to think, these are 4 and 5-year-olds. How am I going to make that, comprehensible to them? And then using word parts, which we all know as morphology, using those morphemic parts. Wide reading. We heard that this morning. Kids have to be reading lots of different texts, lots of different types of text, lots of different genres. And then again, this focus on language awareness. Okay? Understanding why you construct a sentence a certain way. Understanding why I communicate in a certain way in a certain context. So always having students understand the context, being aware of the language that they're using, and not going up to someone in a formal situation and addressing them informally. And I think when I think about language awareness, the person that taught me that was my mother. Okay, my mother was an English teacher and always said, make sure you address so-and-so by Mr. and Mrs. Make sure you answer the phone this way. I mean, it was very, very formal. So again, interactive read alouds is a great strategy, and then combine that with that explicit vocabulary development. So you'll see in the framework that the snapshots and the vignettes illustrate some of these strategies. So within our classroom, we can incorporate these strategies, but first we have to have a language-rich environment. Okay, that should be in every classroom. And somebody mentioned it earlier, modeling the language, modeling academic vocabulary, modeling complex grammatical structures. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with teachers and talked to them about the highest level of English language development, and we've looked at what does that look like, and they say, I just don't talk like that in the classroom. And I said, you're right, and a lot of teachers don't talk like that in the classroom, but now that we know, let's do that. Let's start using some of that academic language as we talk to students, as we model, as we have conversations. Let's start doing that.
Gina, can I add something?
Yeah.
A long time ago, I saw on CNN, they had this feeling, when they don't have, or they decide nothing else is worth knowing about, they do these little reports. And they had one, in New York, the reporter followed a group of 4-year-olds, preschoolers, who were going to the aquarium. And there's this little boy looking at the seahorses, and she bent out, she said, do you know that in the seahorse family is the daddy who carries the babies? And he looked at her and he says, so what is the role of the female? Right? So, and that stuck with me, because so many times we think as teachers that we are making ourselves comprehensible by dumbing down the language we use in the classroom. When in fact, what we need to do is elevate the language that we use in the classroom and then show them what we mean. Show me what you, so I'm doing and I'm pointing and I'm finding the example and I'm acting it out. And teachers, especially in elementary schools, we're performers. Don't share that with the middle school that's coming next. But elementary, we are performers. We're showing. With expression. So it's about using that language, modeling it. And another example, when I was a principal, I walked into the kindergarten classroom and I was going to do an observation, and there was a couple of students, a teacher was watching, and I said, "Oh, are you at recess?" And he said, "No, this is hydration break." And I said, "What does that mean?" "That we go to the bathroom and take water and drink water." Like, that is hydration. No, this is a hydration break. And this is just an English learner, and he said it with an accent, but I understood what he meant. Where do you think he learned that word? From the teacher saying, "Boys and girls, let's get ready for our hydration break." It wasn't about, today we're going to learn the word hydration. Say it with me, hydration. How many syllables? That is not developmentally appropriate. That may be appropriate for later on if we're talking about parts, morphology, and building our word bank or in a unit. But in kindergarten, in kinder and first and second and third, we use these big words. Yeah. And the kids listen and they pick up on them. And they may start using them a little off, and then it's an opportunity for that feedback, right? And so that's how we model in the big books, the read alouds. What a wonderful opportunity, and something that we already do in elementary. And now we can repurpose our read alouds as a language development tool. If that's not, sometimes we were doing to model for students what fluent reading sounds like, or to expose them to higher level vocabulary, and now we can repurpose that read aloud as an opportunity to develop academic language and develop the registers and the vocabulary they need to be successful.
I think also when you use the more academic language, you'll be surprised at what students produce. You know, they always surprise me with this little book about the dogs. When I asked the students, how does the dog help the person who's blind? And I heard a little tiny voice over there, and she said, the dog helps, the dog, you know how they talk, the dog leads the way. And I said, you're right, the dog leads the way for the man who can't see. So had I not directed that lesson that way, that wouldn't have come out. So again, last point that's really important is having student practice. Because we can talk and talk and talk and talk, and we all do it. But once you've modeled that language, what opportunities do students have to practice and to explore the language? So take 1 minute and talk to a partner. How do you promote that? How do you plan for students to practice the academic language that's being taught?
And if you're in a supportive role, helping teachers, think about how do you help those teachers think about this way.
Great. So we want to have an opportunity for you to look at the vignette. So we're going to look at the vignette next.
So, and then I just want to make a last point here, how important this is, because it looks like I can't keep a job, but I've done many things. And, I can't keep a job. I'm just curious, right? I do different things. So one of the things that I've done even as a principal, and now I've done some coaching for teachers, and I've been a principal, so I've been in classrooms a lot, and then I do coaching for principals now, and I'm in classrooms with the principals. And I can't tell you how many times I walk in and the teacher is using beautiful academic language. Beautiful academic language. High elevated, complex, and the students are not using academic, are not talking. Or when they're talking for just a minute and as quickly as a processing, as a thinking aloud, but not really, because, and my takeaway in those situations is that this is not going to happen naturally in many of our classrooms. And I have a colleague who calls whoop-de-doo schools, where the kids are successful when they already come to school knowing the things that we think we're going to teach them. In those schools, the kids may have opportunities to talk this way at home, and in some of our schools, they may or may not. Right? But this kind of conversation, this kind of language has to happen in the classroom, in school. And not just in the classroom, in every interaction with every adult on campus, this needs to happen. If we make it a purpose that every time every adult, the principal interacts with the students, we expect maybe a register, so using academic language. When the new supervisor, when the instructional assistants, if we have any of those anymore anywhere, talk, any person that interacts, not their classroom teacher, another classroom teacher interacts, all of us have an opportunity to model and expect students use that language. We had a program at our school. We were teaching, we decided one year to be very intentional about vocabulary development and tier 2 words. So the teachers decided there's a word per week, and you know, they were on the name tag. And our attempt at building some vocabulary. But the fun part was that once we talked about it, we used it in context, we found it in books, the kids use it in writing. Every time they heard the teacher use the word, or every time they heard a student use the word, there was a point system in the classroom. So they would get, the class would get 1 point if the teacher used it, and 3 points if the students used it. And if they heard the principal use it over the overcome, oh, so I was next to a second grade classroom, and one time we had to use due to the fact that it's raining today, due to the fact, that it's raining, we are going on rainy day schedule. And I heard the kids, the second grade, yeah! Because they heard the expression due to the fact. So it was a school-wide, we could have done better, absolutely, but it was our school-wide effort to build, increase the level. And so the kids would come to me at recess, and their task was to use it in a sentence, or use whatever word they were learning in a sentence. And if I only written down the sentences that I heard. It was funny, but it was our attempt to make this a school-wide effort, okay? So you have the vignette, and what I like you to do, and we have about 25 minutes. So here's, because we want to talk, right? We talk. So how many of you are familiar with the structure of the vignettes in the framework? Excellent, good. So the way it's organized, and you heard this morning, the snapshots are very short scenarios. The vignettes have much more information. I'm finding that I'm working with teachers, understanding language development. The vignettes are giving me so much more I can work with the teachers. So I really, although the snapshots may look like they're quicker to read, the vignettes are much richer because they have a lot of the background information that you need to understand where the teacher is coming from. Am I right? No? Okay, thank you. So in this vignette, and then the other part is that it has the companion designated ELD part. So to really understand the difference, the vignettes are right on. So the vignette they give you a background for the lesson, and then they give you a context. Where is this fit within the unit, or the unit of study, or what the class has been studying? Then you have the standards, or the learning target, and the standards embedded in the learning target that the teachers are addressing. Is a teacher, but is always a collaborative, is a teamwork that the teachers are addressing within that lesson. And then you get a summary of what the lesson is, and then you get the strategy and information about sometimes a sample of the text that the students are reading, and importantly, some of the dialogue, what goes back and forth between the students as they work, teacher reflection, next steps, and then at the end, some information summaries. Yes.
Also in the background, you get the classroom context.
Yes.
How many English learners, how many, what grade level learning, all of that. So that way you can get a better picture of who was this lesson for.
So the way we're going to do this, I'm going to have you assign yourselves an A or a B. So if we go count yourselves, it's hard to say when you're assigning a letter. You do once or two. Letter off. Thank you. Letter. So we start here. You. A. Okay, Ace, raise your hand. So Ace, what I'd like you to do, I'm going to read part of the vignette, and then you're going to read part of the vignette if I can find my notes. Ace, what I'd like you to do is find examples of intentional academic language development for all students as I read, either in the planning that took place or in the lesson. So you're going to listen and read for. That's your purpose for listening and or reading. Examples of intentional academic language development. B's, raise your hand. B's, you're going to find examples, listen and or read, looking for supports for English learners, intentional supports for English learners. Okay, and then all B and C. All, because initially I thought it was A, B, and C, and then I said, wait a minute, the last point is for everybody. Everyone is looking for a strategy or an idea from this vignette that you can take back and share with others or use yourself. Okay, so A's, examples of intentional language development. B, examples of intentional supports. C, A's and B's, everyone, A's and B's, identify the strategy. And by identifying the strategy, I also want you to think, how would I modify this? What would I do differently? Because you'll see in the class composition, the way it's designed supports that class. But if I have a different group of students, how might I differentiate, modify, adjust the strategy so that it works for my students as well? So I'm going to start reading very quickly. And the background of the lesson: in science, Mr. Franklin has been teaching his third graders about plants and interdependent relationships in ecosystems. He's been reading aloud and teaching his students to independently read complex literary and informational texts on the topic in both science and language arts. His class of 33 students, located in an urban neighborhood with families from upper middle class and working class families, is quite diverse linguistically, culturally, and ethnically. 15 of his students are ELs with several different home languages. Most of Mr. Franklin's ELs have been in the school since kindergarten, and most are at an early bridging level of English language proficiency in most areas. A few of his English learners are at the expanding level of English language proficiency. 5 of Mr. Franklin's students have been identified as having mild learning disabilities. Because of the diversity of needs in his classroom, Mr. Franklin looks for teaching approaches that will meet many of the learning needs of most of his students. And this is about first best instruction, right? First best instruction for all students. So here's the context. Mr. Franklin and his third grade teaching team, and in every vignette you're going to find that teachers have collaborated in the planning of a lesson, because that's the message we want to promote. And his third grade teaching team meet weekly to plan lessons, discuss student work and assessment results, and read articles to refine their practice. Lately, Mr. Franklin and his colleagues have noticed that when their students approach complex informational texts, many of them give up as soon as the language in the text starts becoming challenging. Sounds familiar for many of us. The teachers work together to plan a series of lessons focusing intensively on teaching their students how to read complex informational texts more closely, using the resources in their staff professional library. They decide to teach students a comprehension strategy called collaborative summarizing. They plan a series of lessons to teach a process of the strategy incrementally over the next week. And if the strategy seems useful, they plan to incorporate it into their instruction 2 or 3 times per week as recommended in the resources they find. They agree to check back with one another in the following week to compare their observation notes on how students responded to instruction. Based on his collaborative planning with his colleagues, the learning target and clusters for the standards, the next day lesson are as following. So you have the learning target, and you see the standards are addressed in the lesson. So why don't you now read silently from lesson excerpt to the end. About 5 minutes. Skim reading. Remember, you A's, you're looking for explicit language development. B, you're finding intentional supports, and all looking for how to use this strategy. So before we discuss this, I just want, before I forget, is there anything we've talked about today that does not apply to dual language programs if the students are learning in a different language? About academic language, about registers, about high level, about vocabulary, demystifying the language, using read alouds as a tool for vocabulary, for modeling the language. All of it applies if you're teaching in a different language as well. So just keep that in mind. So A's, who are my A's? Don't hide, I can count. Okay. Can you share? And then one thing we're gonna find is that a lot of them overlap, right? I know it's an artificial, but just for the conversation. A's, can you share some examples of intentional academic language development for students? Yes, please. Thank you. And I want you, just in case, do you notice which text that we're using? It's a text that they had already read. That's important. That's an important point to remember, is you're not trying to help the students learn the strategy and comprehend the text at the same time. They had read the text already. Now we're focusing on learning the strategy. So that, right, that lowering the cognitive demand or the actual reading comprehension while increasing the cognitive load of learning how to use the strategy and really identifying the words and building the summary from there. So how about intentional supports for English learner? B's. Yeah. That's support. And that I wrote on the margin, if I were doing this, maybe I would do a little more supports, because I'm thinking of my students in the past. They would have been a very different class profile. Oh. So I would have had to put a lot more supports. But the goal and the activity is the same. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't lower down the expectations or use a simpler text. It's scaffold up, not watered down. So another, yes. We talk about the think out loud is demystifying, like the magic trick behind the magician, right? Here's how we think about this. This is how I summarize this text. Another, anyone can give me an example of how you would use, oh, I'm sorry, yes, please.
I just want to also add that using Doug Fisher's phrase, gradual release of responsibility.
Beautifully illustrated in there.
Yes.
Beautifully illustrated. That gradual release is gradual and it is a release, right? They are doing more of the work, but it's very scaffolded, very planned, very intentional. And it's not, I do, now you go and do, which is what we see very often.
Definitely. So we are complete. Our takeaway, when Debbie and I were preparing for this, we were trying to think, okay, what's the TPR? What can we have you walk away with that you'll remember? So this theme is really about language development for all, with ELD being amplified, just like she did it you can do it on that PowerPoint. We want language development for all students and amplified for English learners. You have an evaluation which I see people are pulling out, that's blue. And there's also the Q&A at what time, Cynthia? Yeah, towards the end of the day, there's going to be a Q&A with the authors, and Cynthia has some index cards.
So those of us who have gone through the chapters looking for the right vignette appreciate the indexing of vignettes. So that's a wrap for us. Thank you so much for attending today. We appreciate your comments and your feedback. Enjoy the rest of your day.